Fire was dying. That was the first thing. Just a few angry embers spitting in a stone hearth that couldn't fight the cold seeping through the log walls. The wind outside wasn't just howling, it was screaming. A physical thing that clawed at the little cabin. The second thing was the silence from the corner. The silence where her husband Thomas should have been. But Thomas was 3 weeks in the frozen ground out back, under a crude wooden cross that was now buried beneath 4 feet of snow. Gone. Taken by a fever that burned through him in less than 2 days, leaving her utterly, terrifyingly alone. The third thing was the sound that was just beginning. A tiny whimper from the makeshift cradle near the fire. Then another. James and Emily. Her twins. Born into a world of promises, and now living in a world of ice and silence. They were hungry. They were cold. And their mother, Sarah Mitchell, had nothing left. The firewood was gone. The food was almost gone. And her hope was the coldest thing of all. She had come to the Colorado Territory from Pennsylvania with dreams of a cattle ranch, of a big life under a big sky. Now all she dreamed of was surviving the next hour. She stared through the frost-caked window at the white wall of the blizzard, a swirling vortex of nothingness. This was it. This was how it ended. For her babies. A cruel, quiet fade into the cold. She closed her eyes, a single tear freezing on her cheek, and that's when she saw it. A shadow, a figure tall and broad, materializing out of the blinding snow at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a person, standing there as still as a frozen tree, watching her cabin. Sarah's heart didn't leap with hope. It seized with pure, primal fear. Because in the winter of 1873, in the middle of the most brutal blizzard the territory had ever seen, a visitor didn't mean salvation. It meant the end had arrived in a different form. The figure outside didn't move for a long minute. Sarah's mind raced. Who could be out in this? No settler would be traveling. It had to be a hunter, maybe an outlaw. Her hand went to the heavy rifle Thomas had left propped by the door. She'd fired it once, at a tin can. Her shoulder had ached for a week, but she grabbed it now. The cold steel a shocking jolt to her skin. The weight of it was both terrifying and the only comfort she had left. The twins whimpered again, a little louder this time, a symphony of desperation. The shadow outside took a step forward, then another. It moved with a strange gliding grace over the deep snow, not sinking like a normal man would. Sarah realized he was wearing snowshoes, expertly crafted. He was dressed in thick buckskins and furs, a stark, powerful silhouette against the white chaos. As he got closer, she could see the strong lines of his face, weathered and unreadable, framed by long, dark hair. He carried a bow on his back and a sheathed knife at his hip. He was Comanche. Every horror story she'd ever heard on the long journey west flooded her mind. Tales of raids, of violence, of settlers disappearing without a trace. Her hand trembled on the rifle. This was a nightmare, a final cruel joke from a merciless God. The man stopped 10 feet from her door. He didn't call out. He just stood there, his dark eyes fixed on the cabin, on the thin wisp of smoke that was all that was left of her fire. It was as if he could see right through the walls, right into her soul, and see the sheer terror she was feeling. The silence stretched, broken only by the shriek of the wind and the growing cries of her babies. Then he raised a hand. Not in aggression. It was a slow, deliberate gesture, a sign of peace. But Sarah didn't see peace. She saw a predator assessing its prey. She saw a man who belonged in this brutal wilderness, a man who survived it, and she was a woman who was dying in it. She lifted the rifle, the barrel shaking, and pointed it at the door. Her voice was a dry, cracked whisper. "Who's there?" A moment passed. Then a voice came back, deep and calm, somehow cutting through the wind. "I saw your smoke. It is weak. You are in trouble." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Sarah's mind was a whirlwind. He could kill her. He could leave her to freeze. Both options ended the same way for her children. A strange, reckless thought broke through the fog of her fear. If this was the end, it wouldn't be a quiet one. "I have a rifle," she called out, trying to make her voice strong, and I will use it." There was another pause. She could almost feel him considering her words. Then came the reply, and the words he spoke sent a new kind of chill down her spine, one that had nothing to do with the cold. "I know. I can see the barrel shaking through the crack in the door frame. You are alone. Your husband is dead, and your children are crying." He knew. He knew everything. How could he possibly know? Sarah's blood ran cold. She pressed her eye to the very crack he'd mentioned, a tiny gap between the warped wooden planks of the door. The man was still there, his gaze unwavering. He hadn't moved. He hadn't checked the grave. How could he know Thomas was gone? "My name is Coda," the man said, his voice steady. "I am a hunter of the Comanche. The storm separated me from my people. I mean you no harm. I offer help." "Help!" The word sounded foreign, like a language she'd forgotten. All she had known for weeks was loss and struggle. Trusting this man felt like a greater gamble than trusting the storm. But the twins' cries were getting weaker now, turning into thin, exhausted whimpers. That sound, more than anything, broke through her fear. She kept the rifle aimed at the door but spoke again. "Why would you help me?" "Because no one survives this land alone," he said simply. "Not Comanche, not settler. The winter does not care what god you pray to. Now your fire is almost out. Let me in, or we will both be paying our respects to your husband by morning." The finality in his voice was absolute. He wasn't threatening her. He was telling her the truth. She looked from the dying embers to the crying infants in their cradle. Her own life felt cheap, disposable. But theirs were still new, still full of a promise she had a duty to protect, no matter the cost. Even if the cost was trusting a man she had every reason to fear. With a shaking hand, she unlatched the heavy wooden bar across the door. It made a groaning sound as she slid it back. "The door is open," she called out, her voice barely audible. She backed away, keeping the rifle raised, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The door creaked open, pushed by the wind, and for a moment, the blizzard itself seemed to pour into the room, a swirl of snow and ice. Then the man stepped inside, filling the doorway, blocking out the storm. He was even larger up close, a mountain of fur and leather. He moved with a quiet confidence that was both intimidating and strangely reassuring. His eyes, dark and incredibly perceptive, took in the entire scene in a single glance. The bare shelves, the pitiful pile of kindling, the rifle in her trembling hands, and finally the cradle, where James and Emily lay whimpering. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. He slowly, deliberately, unslung the bow from his back and laid it on the floor, a clear sign of peace. "First, we build the fire," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. He walked past her, giving the rifle a wide berth, and knelt at the hearth. He pulled a small leather pouch from his belt, taking out a piece of flint and steel. From another pouch, he produced a handful of dry tinder he must have kept on his person. In seconds, with practiced, efficient movements, he had a tiny flame flickering. He fed it small twigs, coaxing it, nurturing it. Sarah watched, mesmerized. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. As the fire grew, he looked over his shoulder at her. "I will get more wood. Then we will talk about food." He stood and went back outside without another word. Sarah stood frozen, the heavy rifle still in her hands. She listened to the sharp, rhythmic thwack of an axe biting into frozen wood. A few minutes later, he returned, his arms laden with freshly split pine. He stacked it neatly by the hearth. The wood smelled clean and sharp, the scent of life itself. He turned to her, his gaze finally meeting hers directly. "Your children, how old?" "3 weeks," Sarah whispered, finding her voice. "James and Emily." Coda nodded slowly, his eyes drifting back to the cradle. "They are small, but they have strong spirits to have survived this long." He paused, and a shadow seemed to cross his face. "You were wise to let me in. Another day, and their spirits would have flown." As he spoke, he reached into his pack and pulled out something wrapped in oiled cloth. He unwrapped it to reveal a large piece of venison, frozen solid. "I brought meat." Sarah finally lowered the rifle. The strength went out of her arms, and the heavy gun clattered to the floor. The sound echoed in the sudden warmth of the room. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry. Not when she buried Thomas. Not when the blizzard hit, suddenly streamed down her face. She didn't make a sound, just stood there, shaking as tears of grief and terror and a tiny, fragile spark of hope all poured out at once. Coda didn't move. He didn't offer comfort or platitudes. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, allowing her the dignity of her grief. When her sobs finally subsided, he spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. The journey to the nearest settlement is impossible with infants. My people have a winter camp a day's journey from here. There is food, warmth, and safety. When the sun rises, I will take you there. Sarah stared at him, shocked. Go with him? To a Comanche camp? The idea was insane. It was trading one certain death for another, more terrifying one. They wouldn't want us, she stammered. A white woman and her babies? My mother is a healer, Coda said, cutting her off. My chief Grey Wolf is a man of honor. They do not turn away children. The choice is yours. Stay here and die when the food runs out again, or come with me and live. He laid out the choice with brutal simplicity, and as Sarah looked at her sleeping infants, now quiet and warm for the first time in days, she knew there wasn't really a choice at all. But as she agreed, a nagging question formed in her mind, a cold knot of suspicion that wouldn't go away. How did he really know her husband was dead before he even set foot in her cabin? The wind couldn't have told him that. The next morning broke cold and painfully bright. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world sculpted in white, the sun glinting off a sea of endless snow. Coda was already awake, having taken turns with Sarah through the night to keep the fire roaring. He had fashioned a travois, a simple sled, from the planks of the broken-down shed behind the cabin. He lined it with every blanket and fur Sarah possessed, creating a deep, warm nest. The children will ride here, he instructed. Together, their body heat will help keep them warm. Sarah bundled James and Emily in layers of wool until they looked like two tiny, helpless parcels. As she placed them gently into the nest on the travois, Coda produced 2 pairs of snowshoes, one for him and a smaller, hastily made pair for her. Walk in my tracks, he said. It will be easier. She took one last look around the cabin, the home she and Thomas had poured their dreams into. It looked so small, so fragile against the vast, indifferent landscape. I'll be back, she whispered, a promise to the ghost of her husband. Coda strapped the harness of the travois across his powerful chest and shoulders. He was a machine built for this world. He leaned into the weight and began to move, pulling the sled with a steady, relentless pace. Sarah followed, her own movements clumsy and awkward on the strange footwear. But she pushed on, her eyes fixed on the precious cargo Coda was pulling. They traveled for hours in silence, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of their snowshoes and the whisper of the wind. The cold was a physical enemy, biting at any exposed skin. Coda stopped every hour, checking on the twins, allowing Sarah to feed them, and sharing strips of dried venison. The babies, amazingly, slept for most of the journey, lulled by the motion. Near midday, as they paused in the shelter of a rocky outcropping, Sarah finally voiced the question that had been tormenting her. Coda, back at the cabin, how did you know Thomas was gone? Coda didn't look at her. He stared out at the horizon, his eyes narrowed. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. There was no smoke from the chimney when I first saw the cabin, he said slowly. Then a tiny wisp appeared, a desperate fire. A man with a family would have laid in a cord of wood for the winter. He would have kept a strong fire. Only a person alone, and running out of fuel, would make a fire so small. It was logical. It was brilliant. But it wasn't the whole truth. She could feel it. And the grave? She pressed. You didn't see it. It was buried in snow. He turned to look at her then, and his eyes were dark with a history she couldn't begin to understand. I did not need to see the grave, he said, his voice low. I could smell the sickness on the wind, and I could smell the leaving. He seemed to search for the English word. When a spirit leaves its body in the cold, the air changes. I have known that scent my whole life. Sarah shivered, and it wasn't from the cold. The explanation was both mystical and deeply unsettling. It made him seem like more than just a man. He was a part of this wild land, connected to it in ways she couldn't comprehend. They continued their journey, but now a new tension hung in the air. Sarah's trust in him was a fragile thing, a sapling in a storm, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still holding something back. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the landscape started to change. They entered a narrow pass between two high ridges. "The valley of my people is just beyond this pass," Coda said, his voice tight. "We are almost there." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of relief and pure terror. What was waiting for them on the other side? A warm welcome or a brutal end? As they cleared the top of the pass, Coda stopped. He stood for a moment, looking down into the valley below. Then he turned to Sarah, his face grim. "They have seen us," he said. Sarah looked past him. In the valley below, nestled beside a steaming hot spring, was a circle of 24 teepees. Smoke rose from their peaks, and riding out to meet them, moving fast, was a group of 4 warriors on horseback, their faces like stone. "Do not be afraid," Coda said, but his hand had moved to the knife at his belt. "They are my brothers. They are coming to help." But as the riders thundered closer, their expressions weren't welcoming. They were hard, suspicious, and angry. One of the warriors shouted something at Coda in Comanche, his voice sharp and accusatory. Coda shouted back, his tone defensive. The exchange was heated, aggressive. This wasn't a welcome party, it was an interrogation. The lead warrior, a man with a jagged scar across his cheek, pointed a lance not at Coda, but directly at Sarah. He spat another torrent of angry words. Sarah's blood turned to ice. "Coda, what is he saying? What's wrong?" Coda turned to her, and the calm confidence she had come to rely on was gone. In its place was a look of deep, profound trouble. "He knows who you are," Coda said, his voice barely a whisper. "Or rather, he knows who your husband was." He took a breath, the truth finally coming out. A secret far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Thomas Mitchell was not just a farmer, Sarah. To these men, he was a thief, and they have been waiting for him. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. A thief? Thomas? It was impossible. He was the most honest man she had ever known. A man who worked himself to the bone, who dreamed of building a life for them with his own 2 hands. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Thomas bought our land. We have the deed, signed and sealed in Denver." The scarred warrior barked another command. Coda ignored him, his focus entirely on Sarah. "The land you bought, the valley your cabin sits in, it was a sacred wintering ground for abandoned my people, a place with good water and shelter. They were pushed out 2 summers ago by a treaty they never agreed to. A treaty signed by men in uniforms who promised them new lands farther south." "But that's not Thomas's fault," Sarah cried. "He didn't know." "It doesn't matter," Coda said grimly. "When the band was forced to move, they had to leave their winter stores behind. Furs, dried meat, tools. They intended to come back for them. But when they returned, the stores were gone, and a new cabin was being built." The scarred warrior dismounted, stalking toward them. His eyes were filled with a cold fire. Coda stepped in front of Sarah protectively. "His name is Stone Claw," Coda said in a low voice. "It was his band, his family's supplies that were taken. He believes your husband stole them to survive his first winter." "No," Sarah gasped. "Thomas would never. We brought supplies from Pennsylvania. We struggled, yes, but he would never steal." But even as she said it, a sliver of doubt pierced her heart. She remembered how hard that first autumn had been, how their own supplies had dwindled faster than they'd expected. Had Thomas found those stores? Had he taken them, believing them abandoned, never telling her out of pride or shame? Stoneclaw stopped in front of Coda, speaking in low, guttural Comanche. Coda replied, his voice calm but firm. The other riders circled them, their horses snorting plumes of steam in the frigid air, their faces grim masks. Sarah felt like a mouse cornered by wolves. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Coda turned back to her. He does not believe you. He says a white man's word is like smoke. He demands justice. He wants to search the travois. Sarah clutched the side of the sled where her babies lay sleeping, oblivious. No, you can't let them. I have no choice, Coda said. To refuse is to admit guilt. He stepped aside. Stoneclaw moved to the travois, his scarred face a snarl of contempt. He reached down with a rough hand and began pulling back the furs. Sarah cried out, a raw, desperate sound. She lunged forward, but one of the other warriors blocked her path, his arm like an iron bar. Stoneclaw ripped the final blanket away, and then he froze. His eyes widened. The anger in his face dissolved, replaced by something else. Shock, disbelief, reverence. He stared down at the two tiny sleeping faces of James and Emily. He slowly, hesitantly, reached out a finger and gently touched James's cheek. He murmured a single word in Comanche, his voice filled with awe. Then he looked up, not at Sarah, but at Coda, his eyes wide with a question that seemed to shake him to his core. The other warriors moved in, looking into the sled. Their hard faces softened, their aggressive posture melted away. They began to murmur amongst themselves, their voices low and astonished. Coda, what is it? Sarah pleaded, her mind reeling. What are they saying? Coda looked at her, and for the first time, a small, cryptic smile touched his lips. They are saying that your children have saved your life. But why? What do they see? Coda's smile faded, his expression turning serious once more. It is a long story, but the mark on your son's forehead, it is the same mark that was borne by the last great prophet of our people, a man who died 100 winters ago. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Stoneclaw is not a friend to white men, Sarah, but he would never, ever harm a child who carries the sign of the Great Spirit. The tension that had crackled in the air vanished as if it had never been. Stoneclaw and his warriors, who moments before had looked ready to kill, now treated the travois like a holy relic. They insisted on escorting them the rest of the way, not as prisoners, but as honored guests. Stoneclaw himself walked beside the sled, his eyes constantly straying to the tiny, sleeping face of James. As they entered the main camp, a murmur went through the crowd that had gathered. The story of the baby with the prophet's mark spread like wildfire. An old man with a face like a wrinkled map emerged from the largest teepee. This, Coda whispered, was Chief Grey Wolf. Grey Wolf approached, his eyes wise and piercing. He listened as Stoneclaw recounted what had happened. Then he came to the travois and looked down at the twins for a long time. Finally, he looked at Sarah, his expression unreadable. He spoke in slow, accented English. Coda has told me of your loss, of your struggle. The Comanche do not turn away a mother and her children, but the matter of the stolen goods remains. I swear to you, my husband was not a thief, Sarah said, finding her courage. He was an honorable man. Grey Wolf held her gaze. Honor is proven by actions, not words. You and your children will be guests in my son Coda's mother's lodge. You will be safe. You will be fed. But this debt, it must be answered for. It was both a reprieve and a sentence. They were safe for now, but they were still on trial. Coda led her to a teepee near the center of the camp. An older woman with Coda's same dark, intelligent eyes stood waiting. This was Willow Song, his mother. She didn't speak English, but her hands were gentle as she helped Sarah lift the sleeping twins from the travois. She cooed over them, her weathered face softening as she, too, saw the small, crescent-shaped birthmark on James's forehead. Life in the camp was a strange new world. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by survival. The men hunted, the women prepared food, tanned hides, and cared for the children. At first, Sarah felt like an outsider, a ghost in their world. The other women were polite but distant. They watched her with curious, guarded eyes. Stoneclaw's band was still angry about their lost supplies, and their hostility was a constant, unspoken presence. But Sarah was a survivor. She had learned that in the cabin. She was determined not to be a burden. She watched Willow Song, learning by observing. She learned to grind corn, to sew with sinew, to mend moccasins. She insisted on doing her share of the work, her hands, once soft, growing calloused and capable. Slowly, very slowly, things began to change. The women started to include her in their conversations, with Coda or Willow Song translating. They saw her dedication to her children, a language that needed no translation. They saw her resilience. They began to see her not as a white woman, but as Sarah, a mother, a widow, a person. Coda was her constant link to this new life. He taught her words in his language. He told her stories of his people, and he began to tell her stories of his own life. His father had been a white fur trader who had fallen in love with Willowsong. Coda had grown up between two worlds, comfortable in neither, fluent in both. To many settlers, I am too Indian to be trusted, he told her one evening as they sat outside the teepee, watching the stars. To some of my own people, like Stone Claw, I am too white. And what do you think you are? Sarah asked softly. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. I am myself, he said simply. It was during these quiet conversations that Sarah began to see the man behind the stoic hunter. She saw his intelligence, his deep sense of honor, and a gentleness he rarely showed the world. And she found herself drawn to it, a moth to a flame. It was a terrifying, confusing feeling. She still mourned Thomas, but her heart, a thing she thought had frozen solid, was beginning to thaw. One afternoon, a trading party returned from the settlement of Willow Creek, 15 miles away. They brought news. Coda found her mending one of James's blankets. His face was serious. The traders spoke of a man at the post, a settler. He has been asking about a cabin in your valley, about a woman with newborn twins whose husband died. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Who? His name is Marshall Jensen, Coda said, his eyes watchful. He told the traders he owns the land next to yours. He says he made a promise to your husband, Thomas. A promise to look out for his family if anything happened to him. Marshall Jensen. The name was vaguely familiar. Thomas had mentioned a neighbor he'd met briefly in Denver. A good man, he'd said. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over Sarah. Hope, confusion, and a strange sort of dread. A connection to her old life. A way out. But did she want a way out? He is searching for you, Coda continued. He fears you perished in the blizzard. The news spread through the camp. A white man was looking for her. This changed everything. To Stone Claw and his followers, this was proof of her connection to the outside world, the world that had wronged them. Their suspicion intensified, but to others it was a sign. Chief Gray Wolf summoned her to his lodge. This man Jensen, the chief said, his voice grave, he offers you a return to your own world. Is this what you wish? Sarah looked at Coda, who stood silently in the corner of the lodge. Then she looked at the chief. I don't know, she answered honestly. My life is here now. You are here because of a debt, Gray Wolf reminded her gently. A debt that is still unpaid. Perhaps this man can help you pay it. And that's when Chief Gray Wolf made a decision that would change all of their lives. A plan so audacious, so dangerous, it took Sarah's breath away. Coda will guide you to this Marshall Jensen, the chief declared. You will ask him for help, not for yourself. You will ask him to replace the winter stores that Stoneclaw's people lost. You will tell him this is the price of peace, the price for your husband's mistake. It was a test of her loyalty, a test of Jensen's honor, and a direct confrontation with the past. Sarah knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this journey wouldn't lead to a simple rescue. It was leading to a reckoning. The journey to Marshall Jensen's homestead was a world away from the desperate flight through the blizzard. The snow had begun to melt under a strengthening March sun. The world was slowly coming back to life. But Sarah's anxiety was a cold knot in her stomach. Coda rode beside her, silent and watchful. A single warrior from Gray Wolf's own family, a young man named Little Fox, rode behind them, a silent testament to the fact that this was official business. They found Jensen's homestead easily. It was larger than hers, with a sturdy cabin and the beginnings of a large barn. As they approached, a man came out onto the porch, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and wary eyes. That's far enough, he called out. Mr. Jensen? Sarah called back, her voice unsteady. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I believe you've been looking for me. Jensen's eyes widened in shock. He stared from her to Coda, then back again. Mrs. Mitchell? My God, we thought you were dead. He lowered the rifle, his face flooding with relief. You're safe. And the children? They are safe too, Sarah said. Thanks to Coda here. He and his people took us in. Jensen's gaze on Coda was filled with a mixture of gratitude and the ingrained suspicion of the frontier. Well, I am in this man's debt then. He ushered them forward. Please come inside. My wife Elizabeth will be overjoyed. She's been praying for you. Elizabeth Jensen was a kind-faced woman who immediately fussed over Sarah, clucking with sympathy when she heard the story of her ordeal. She insisted they stay for a meal. While the women talked, Jensen and Coda stood on the porch, a silent, tense standoff between two different worlds. When the time felt right, Sarah took a deep breath and explained Chief Greywolf's proposal. She told him about Stone Claw, the lost supplies, and the lingering suspicion over Thomas's name. As she spoke, a change came over Marshal Jensen. The friendly relief in his eyes hardened. A shuttered, calculating look replaced it. So, the chief wants me to pay for goods your husband supposedly stole? He said, his voice flat. That's a steep price for a little frontier hospitality. It's not about payment, Mr. Jensen, Sarah said earnestly. It's about honor. It's about making things right so my children and I can have a future. I can't go back to my cabin while this debt hangs over us. Jensen stroked his beard. His eyes narrowed in thought. A whole winter's worth of supplies. That's a fortune. Furs, tools, food. He looked from Sarah to the door, where Coda was now standing, his face unreadable. Tell your chief I'll consider it, Jensen said finally. I need to think. It's a serious request. The ride back to the Comanche camp was tense. He will not do it, Coda said, his voice certain. I saw the greed in his eyes. Men like him, they see this land as something to be taken, not shared. He sees your homestead, your water rights, and he sees an opportunity. You're wrong, Sarah insisted, wanting to believe in the good man Thomas had described. He's just being cautious. He'll help us. But 2 days later, a rider from the Jensen homestead arrived at the camp. It wasn't Marshall. It was a hired hand. He carried a message. Jensen's answer was no. He would not pay what he called ransom. Furthermore, he had sent word to the cavalry post at Fort Lyon. He had told them that a white woman and her children were being held against their will by a band of hostile Comanche. He was, he wrote, deeply concerned for their safety. The letter was a declaration of war. Stone Claw and his warriors were enraged. They saw it as the ultimate betrayal. I told you, he snarled at Coda. The white man speaks with a forked tongue. Panic erupted in the camp. A cavalry patrol meant violence. It meant death. They had all heard the stories of massacres, of camps destroyed on the flimsiest of pretexts. Chief Greywolf called an emergency council. The mood was grim. Some argued they should flee, abandon the valley. Others, led by Stone Claw, argued they should fight. Sarah was brought before the council, her heart pounding with guilt and fear. This was her fault. Her connection to the outside world had brought this danger to their door. This man Jensen, Greywolf said, his voice heavy, he has used you. He has used your husband's name, and now he puts all our lives in danger. Why? I don't know, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. I do, said a voice from the back of the lodge. It was Coda. He stepped forward into the firelight, his face set like granite. He held a small, weathered, leather-bound book in his hand. I did not want to believe it, Coda said, his voice ringing with authority. I wanted to believe the man your husband met was a good man, but I did not trust him. So last night, I rode to your cabin, Sarah. Sarah stared at him, confused. My cabin? Why? I went to look for proof of your husband's honor. I searched for any records he might have kept. A journal, a ledger, and hidden beneath a loose floorboard I found this. He held up the book. It was Thomas's journal, the one he'd kept meticulously since they'd left Pennsylvania. Your husband was not a thief, Coda declared, his voice cutting through the tense silence. He was a witness. He opened the journal. Thomas Mitchell did meet Marshall Jensen in Denver, and he saw Jensen cheating another man in a card game, winning the deed to a worthless piece of land. Thomas confronted him. He threatened to expose him. Coda looked directly at Sarah, his eyes filled with a sad understanding. Jensen didn't promise to look after you, Sarah. He threatened your husband. He told Thomas that if he ever spoke of what he saw, Jensen would make sure his new family never saw their first spring in the Colorado Territory. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Jensen wasn't a concerned neighbor. He was a predator who had been waiting for Thomas to die. He wanted her land, the land with the good water. He had used her, manipulated her, and now he was calling in the cavalry to wipe out anyone who stood in his way. And there is more, Coda said, his voice dropping low, filled with a cold fury. He flipped to the last entry in the journal, dated just 2 days before Thomas died. On his final trip to the trading post for medicine, Coda read, Thomas saw something. He saw Marshall Jensen meeting with 2 men. Men who were trading a large cache of furs and supplies. Furs and supplies that matched the description of those stolen from Stone Claw's band. The entire council erupted. Stone Claw's face was a mask of disbelief, then dawning murderous rage. Thomas hadn't been the thief. He had been the only witness to the real crime. And Marshall Jensen hadn't just stolen supplies. He had likely orchestrated Thomas's death to silence him. The fever that had taken her husband so quickly, had it been a fever at all? Or had it been something far more sinister? The cavalry wasn't coming to rescue her. They were coming to eliminate the evidence. And everyone in this camp, Sarah, her children, Coda, and all his people, were now loose ends in Marshall Jensen's deadly game. Chaos. Pure, unadulterated chaos. Stone Claw's warriors wanted blood. They wanted to ride to the Jensen homestead and burn it to the ground. It took all of Chief Grey Wolf's authority to stop them. To attack is to prove Jensen right, the chief thundered. We would be slaughtered when the soldiers arrive. We must think not with our anger, but with our minds. But how could they fight a lie? Jensen's story was simple and believable to the outside world. A helpless white woman held captive. Theirs was a complex tale of theft, honor, and a dead man's journal. Who would the cavalry believe? Sarah's mind, once foggy with grief, was now razor-sharp with fury. This man, Jensen, had not only slandered her husband's name, he had likely murdered him. He had threatened her children's lives. The terrified woman who had huddled by a dying fire was gone. In her place was a mother bear ready to defend her cubs at any cost. We have the journal, she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the angry shouts of the warriors. All eyes turned to her. It's proof. It's Thomas's own words. It is the word of one dead white man against the word of a living one, Grey Wolf said grimly. The soldiers will not care. Then we have to make them care, Sarah insisted. She looked at Coda, a desperate, brilliant plan forming in her mind. Coda, you said your father was a traitor. Did he have dealings with the army? Coda nodded slowly. He knew the commander at Fort Lyon, Colonel Abernathy, an old man, but a fair one, my father always said. Then you have to go, Sarah urged. You have to get to the fort before the patrol leaves. Show Abernathy the journal. Tell him the truth. It was a suicide mission, a lone Comanche riding into an army fort with a wild story. He'd be shot before he got within a mile of the gates. No, Coda said flatly. I will not leave you and the children unprotected. And I will not let you all die because of me, Sarah shot back. This started with my family, and I will see it finished. She turned to the chief. Let me go with him. The council was stunned into silence. A white woman and a Comanche hunter riding for help? It was insane. The soldiers will be looking for a captive woman, Sarah argued, her mind working furiously. They won't be looking for a woman riding willingly with a Comanche guide. We might get through their patrols. It's our only chance. Grey Wolf looked at her, then at Coda. He saw the fire in her eyes, the determination on Coda's face. He saw 2 people from different worlds united by a common threat. He considered for a long moment, then gave a single solemn nod. Go. Ride like the wind. May the Great Spirit ride with you. They left within the hour. Willow Song pressed a small pouch of herbs into Sarah's hand. For strength, she said. She hugged Sarah tightly, a gesture of profound trust and fear. Then she took the twins, holding James and Emily close. We will protect them with our lives, she promised. Leaving her children was the hardest thing Sarah had ever done. Every instinct screamed at her to stay. But her mind knew this was the only way to give them a future. They rode hard, pushing their horses to their limits. Coda knew the land, leading them through hidden canyons and over rocky mesas, avoiding the main trails where they might encounter the cavalry patrol. They rode through the day and deep into the night, stopping only for a few hours of exhausted sleep. On the morning of the second day, as they crested a small hill, Coda reined in his horse sharply. He pointed to the valley below. A line of blue-coated riders, at least 30 of them, was moving steadily westward, the cavalry patrol, and they were heading directly for the Comanche camp. "We are too late," Sarah whispered in despair. "No," Coda said, his jaw tight. "They are moving at a walking pace. We are riding for our lives. We can still beat them to the fort." He urged his horse into a gallop, and Sarah followed, her heart pounding with every hoofbeat. It was a race against time, a race against a lie that was riding to destroy everyone she now cared about. They arrived at the gates of Fort Lyon near sundown, their horses lathered and trembling with exhaustion. The sentries immediately raised their rifles. "Halt! State your business." "We need to see Colonel Abernathy," Coda shouted. "It's a matter of life and death." "The colonel doesn't see Comanche visitors," the guard sneered. "He will see me," Sarah said, sliding off her horse. She pushed her way forward, her face smudged with dirt, her clothes torn from the hard ride, but her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and if you don't let us in, the blood of 50 innocent people will be on your hands." Her fierce determination and the sheer shock of seeing a white woman arrive with a Comanche warrior was enough to make the guards hesitate. An officer was called. He listened to their frantic, condensed story with skepticism, but the mention of Marshal Jensen and a murder accusation was enough to grant them an audience with the colonel. Colonel Abernathy was an old man with tired eyes and a neatly trimmed white mustache. He listened patiently as Sarah, with Coda at her side, poured out the entire story, from the blizzard to the journal to Jensen's betrayal. When she was finished, she handed him Thomas's journal. Abernathy read through the last few pages in silence, his expression unreadable. The air in the office was thick with tension. Finally, he closed the book and looked up. "Marshal Jensen," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I know the name. He's filed several complaints about Indian raids in the territory. Always vague, never any proof." He tapped the journal with his finger. However, this is a different matter. A man's private words never meant to be seen." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the setting sun. "I sent a patrol out under the command of a young, hot-headed lieutenant this morning. He was given orders to investigate Mr. Jensen's claims and ensure the safety of any settlers. Jensen has a way of twisting words to his advantage." Sarah's heart sank. "So you're saying you believed him?" Abernathy turned from the window, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion showed in his tired eyes. "I am saying, Mrs. Mitchell, that I have learned to be suspicious of any man who is too eager to start a war." He looked at Coda. "Your father was an honest man, Coda Reynolds. It seems he passed that trait on to his son." He walked to his desk and scribbled a quick note. He handed it to an aide. "Find me Sergeant O'Malley. Tell him to pick the 10 fastest riders and the 10 freshest horses on this post. They ride in 5 minutes." He turned back to them. "O'Malley is the best tracker I have. He will ride to intercept that patrol. I will give him a direct order from me, countermanding the lieutenant's instructions. There will be no violence. He is to bring your people, and Mr. Jensen, back to this fort to give testimony." A wave of relief so powerful it made Sarah dizzy washed over her. "Thank you, Colonel. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet, madam," Abernathy said, his voice grim. "My sergeant is fast, but that lieutenant is foolish and ambitious. And your friend Mr. Jensen is a snake. We are still in a race, and the devil himself doesn't know who will win it." The ride back was an agony of suspense. Sergeant O'Malley, a tough, wiry Irishman who seemed more at home on a horse than on his own 2 feet, led a thunderous charge back across the plains. Sarah and Coda, on fresh mounts, rode with them. They pushed the horses relentlessly, the setting sun at their backs, racing toward a confrontation they prayed they could prevent. They rode through the night, a phantom column of riders under a sky full of cold, indifferent stars. Every gust of wind sounded like gunfire to Sarah. Every shadow looked like a disaster. They reached the pass leading into the Comanche Valley just as the first hint of dawn was staining the eastern sky. O'Malley held up a hand, and the column halted. Below, in the dim pre-dawn light, they could see the camp, and surrounding it, in a loose, threatening circle, were the blue-coated cavalrymen. In the center of the valley, a tense parley was underway. The young lieutenant, a man who looked barely out of his teens, sat on his horse, flanked by a smug-looking Marshal Jensen. Across from them stood Chief Greywolf, Stone Claw, and a dozen of the tribe's best warriors, all on foot, all hopelessly outgunned. "We're too late," Sarah breathed. "No," O'Malley grunted. "The talking's not done yet." "That's good." He turned to his men. "We ride in easy, no guns drawn. Follow my lead." They started down the pass, not at a charge, but at a steady, deliberate walk. Their arrival caused immediate confusion. The lieutenant stared, his mouth agape, as a sergeant and 10 more troopers, along with a white woman and a Comanche, rode calmly into his standoff. Marshal Jensen's face went white as a sheet. The smug confidence drained from him, replaced by the look of a cornered rat. "Sergeant O'Malley," the lieutenant barked, recovering his composure. "What is the meaning of this?" "New orders from Colonel Abernathy, sir," O'Malley said, handing him the sealed note. "He requests your presence, and the presence of all parties involved, back at Fort Lyon to clarify the situation." The lieutenant's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as he read the note. He had clearly been hoping for a quick, decisive, and bloody victory. Jensen spurred his horse forward. "This is an outrage. These savages are holding a white woman hostage. They murdered her husband. I demand you take action, Lieutenant." "That's a lie," Sarah's voice rang out, clear and cold in the morning air. She urged her horse forward until she was beside the lieutenant, her eyes locked on Jensen. "This man is the murderer. He is the thief. And I have the proof." She held up Thomas's journal. The lieutenant, now completely bewildered, looked from Sarah to Jensen, to the stoic face of Chief Greywolf, and back to the note in his hand. His simple black and white world had just exploded into 1,000 shades of gray. "My orders are clear," he said stiffly. "Everyone is to return to the fort." Jensen, seeing the game was up, panicked. He wheeled his horse around, digging his spurs in, trying to make a break for it. He never had a chance. Before anyone could even react, a blur of motion launched from the Comanche line. It was Coda. He ran with the speed of a striking snake, vaulted onto the back of Jensen's fleeing horse, and tackled the larger man from the saddle. They hit the ground in a tangle of limbs. Jensen came up with a knife in his hand, but Coda was too fast. He disarmed him with a single, brutal twist of the wrist and slammed him back to the ground, his own knife pressed against Jensen's throat. The entire valley was silent. "Justice," Coda said, his voice low and dangerous, not to Jensen, but to Stone Claw, who stood watching, his hand on his own weapon. "This is the chief's justice, not ours." He pulled Jensen to his feet and shoved him toward the soldiers. The return to Fort Lyon was a strange procession. The accused, the accusers, the warriors, and the soldiers, all riding together. A trial was held, an unusual affair for the frontier. Colonel Abernathy presided. Sarah testified, reading from Thomas's journal. Coda testified. Chief Greywolf and even Stone Claw spoke, their words translated, telling the story of their lost supplies. The 2 men Thomas had seen trading with Jensen were found and brought in. Under pressure, they confessed. They had been Jensen's hired thugs, paid to steal the supplies, and, they admitted with downcast eyes, to deliver a sickness to Thomas Mitchell's cabin, a blanket tainted with cholera. The verdict was swift and absolute. Marshal Jensen was found guilty of theft, incitement of violence, and the murder of Thomas Mitchell. He was hanged the following morning. In the aftermath, something remarkable happened. As a gesture of goodwill, Colonel Abernathy ordered that the Comanche be compensated for their lost goods from the fort's own stores. The debt of honor was finally paid. Sarah stood with Coda on a hill overlooking the fort, watching as the Comanche prepared to return to their valley. The sun was warm on her face. "What will you do now?" Coda asked quietly. Sarah looked out at the vast open land. It had taken everything from her, and it had given her a new life she never could have imagined. "My cabin is still there," she said. "My husband's grave is there. My children were born there. It's my home." She turned to him, her heart full of a feeling that was no longer confusing or frightening. It was clear. It was certain. But the Comanche proverb is true. No one survives this land alone. "I don't want to be alone anymore, Coda." A slow smile spread across Coda's face, transforming his stoic features. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly, completely happy. He took her hand. His was rough and calloused, hers was smaller, but they fit together perfectly. "Good," he said, "because my home is wherever you and the children are." They returned to the valley not as a settler and a Comanche, but as a family. They rebuilt the cabin, making it stronger. They cleared the land, and together they raised James and Emily, two children of two worlds, who would grow up speaking two languages, understanding two cultures, and carrying the legacy of two brave fathers. They were a bridge, a symbol of a new beginning, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, after the most brutal of storms, hope can find a way to take root and grow. Their life was never easy. They faced suspicion from settlers and occasional hostility from rival tribes. But they faced it together, their love a fortress against the ignorance of the world. They proved that family isn't about the color of your skin or the God you pray to. It's about who stands with you when the fire is dying and the blizzard is screaming at your door. If you enjoyed this story of survival, courage, and unexpected love, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It truly means the world. And let me know in the comments below. What do you think was the bravest thing Sarah did? I read all your comments, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.